While my husband was singing in the shower, celebrating $1 million deal I secured for him, his mistress texted, "Is your wife gone yet?" I didn't throw the phone. I replied, "Come up, she's not coming back tonight." I wasn't leaving, I was just taking out the trash. Let me tell you how it all began. The steam from the master bathroom in our Beverly Hills penthouse carried the scent of expensive sandalwood and the muffled, rhythmic sound of Ethan's humming. He was celebrating. While my husband was singing in the shower, celebrating $1 million deal I had secured for him through months of grueling restoration drafts and sleepless nights, his phone buzzed on the cool marble vanity. I didn't have to guess who it was. The notification flashed with a name that had been a whisper in the back of my mind for weeks. Jessica. "Is your wife gone yet? I'm in the lobby and I can't wait another second," she asked, her words dripping with the entitlement of a woman who thought she had already won. I didn't throw the phone. My hands, trained to handle fragile 17th century porcelain and priceless artifacts, didn't even shake. I simply typed back using his own passcode, our wedding anniversary, a date he clearly only remembered for its utility. "Come up, she's not coming back tonight." I wasn't leaving, I was just taking out the trash. Ethan shouted over the spray of the water, his voice booming with that unearned California tan and teeth charisma. "Mary, babe, is my charcoal Tom Ford suit laid out? We need to look like the power couple of the century at the O'Shea Gala tonight." I looked at the suit, crisp and expensive, bought with the commission from a project he had almost ruined until I stepped in to fix the structural blueprints. For 20 years, I had been the silent engine of Rogers Associates, the one who turned his visions into reality while he worked the room at the Jonathan Club. He thought he was the architect of an empire. He didn't realize he was merely the shiny, hollow hood ornament. "It's ready, Ethan," I replied, my voice as steady as a surgeon's. I walked toward the kitchen, my heels clicking softly on the hardwood, a sound that felt like the ticking of a clock he didn't know was running out. I sat at the kitchen island and poured myself a cup of Earl Grey into my favorite Wedgwood teacup, the fine bone china a stark contrast to the betrayal settling in my chest. I wasn't crying. Tears are for those who are surprised by the ending. I was a restorer, and I had been spotting the cracks in our foundation for years. I reached into the back of the pantry and pulled out a single red Solo plastic cup, a relic from a staff party we'd hosted months ago. I placed it on the granite next to a bottle of chilled San Pellegrino. It was a small, petty preparation, but in my world, details are everything. The elevator chime echoed through the foyer, a sharp, digital announcement of the intruder's arrival. The doorbell followed, insistent and demanding. In the bathroom, the water stopped. "Who the hell is that at this hour?" Ethan called out, his voice tinged with a flicker of annoyance, though I could hear the underlying smirk. He probably thought it was a delivery of more champagne to toast his brilliance. I didn't move. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea, feeling the warmth spread through me as I watched the heavy oak door. The trap wasn't just set. The prey was already inside the house. This wasn't just a divorce. It was a repossession of a life I had built with my own two hands. If you believe a woman's hard work should never be taken for granted, hit the like button and let me know where you're listening from. Your support means everything as I reclaim my life. As I sat there, the steam from the Earl Grey rising to meet the cool, conditioned air of the penthouse, my gaze fell upon my hands. They were steady now, but in the soft glow of the under-cabinet lighting, I could almost see the ghosts of the calluses I carried 20 years ago. We weren't always the Rogers of Beverly Hills. Before the Italian marble and the floor-to-ceiling views of the Pacific, there was a cramped, drafty studio in a forgotten corner of Pasadena. It smelled of turpentine, old dust, and the desperate electric scent of ambition. That was the beginning of our American dream, or rather, the dream I built, brick by brick, and handed to Ethan on a silver platter. I remember the nights when the California heat would cling to the walls, and while Ethan slept soundly, dreaming of the prestige he hadn't yet earned, I would be hunched over a workbench with a magnifying glass and a surgical scalpel. I was the one who could whisper to a shattered 18th century cabinet until it told me its secrets. I was the one who understood that restoration wasn't just about fixing what was broken, but about honoring the soul of the craftsman who came before. Ethan had the charm, the sort of easy, golden boy charisma that makes people want to open their checkbooks just to be in his orbit. But he didn't have the hands. He didn't have the patience. He certainly didn't have the capital. Every cent that started Rogers Associates came from my father's legacy, money he had saved from 40 years of sweat and splinters in a cabinet shop in Ohio. "Invested in us, Mary," Ethan had whispered back then, his eyes bright with a hunger I mistook for love. "We'll build an empire. Your talent, my vision." I believed him because I wanted to believe in the partnership, the sacred bond of a husband and wife pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. I poured my inheritance, my talent, and my youth into his name. I stayed in the shadows, ghostwriting his bids and meticulously drafting the restoration plans that won him the city's most prestigious contracts, while he took the credit at black tie galas. I told myself it didn't matter whose name was on the letterhead, as long as we were building a future together. I even took on the burden of his family, becoming the dutiful daughter-in-law Catherine demanded. I spent my weekends listening to her lectures on the Rogers family heritage, a heritage that, ironically, was being funded by my grueling 12-hour workdays. I managed the bills, I managed the house, and I managed the fragile ego of a man who was becoming increasingly convinced of his own myth. I was the silent partner in every sense of the word, the foundation that allowed him to stand so tall. I thought I was investing in a lifetime of security, a legacy we would leave behind. I thought we were a team. But as the bell for the elevator chimed again, a sharp, cold realization settled in my marrow. I wasn't his partner. I was his benefactor, and he was nothing more than a polished thief who had mistaken my generosity for his own entitlement. The girl downstairs, with her cheap perfume and her borrowed ambition, was just the latest symptom of a rot that had been spreading through the house I built long before tonight. The rot didn't appear overnight. It started with a shift in the way Ethan spoke to me, a subtle sharpening of his tongue that I initially mistook for the stress of high-stakes business. He began to distance himself from the dirty work of our craft. I remember a rainy Tuesday last October when I was finishing the restoration of a Federalist-style mantelpiece. My hair was tied back, and my hands were stained with wood wax when Ethan walked in with a group of potential investors. Instead of introducing me as the creative engine behind the firm, he brushed me off with a wave of his hand, saying, "And this is Mary. She handles the technical bits. She's a wonderful craftsman, but I'm the one who makes the visions profitable." Craftsman. He used the word like a patronizing pat on the head, as if 30 years of expertise were nothing more than a hobby, while he played the role of the visionary businessman. He had forgotten that without my technical bits, his visions were nothing more than expensive smoke and mirrors. Then came the secrecy, the kind that feels like a cold draft in a room with all the windows closed. For 20 years, we had no secrets, no locked doors. But suddenly, his phone was always face down on the nightstand. He changed his passwords, claiming corporate security, though he was arrogant enough to choose our wedding anniversary, a date he figured I'd find sentimental rather than suspicious. But the true red flag, the one that burned through my remaining denial, was the day he asked for a $60,000 withdrawal from my family's private trust fund. He stood in this very kitchen, wearing a cashmere sweater I'd bought him, and told me he needed a Patek Philippe watch to look the part for the upcoming $1 million contract. "Appearance is everything in California, Mary," he'd said with that practiced, toothpaste commercial smile. "You wouldn't understand, being tucked away in your studio all day, but I need to project success to attract it." I gave him the money, not because I believed him, but because I wanted to see how far his greed would lead him. 2 weeks later, while dropping off his dry cleaning, I found a receipt tucked into the inner pocket of his blazer. It wasn't for a man's Patek Philippe. It was for a diamond-encrusted Cartier tank, a woman's watch, dainty and expensive, far too small for his wrist. I didn't scream. I didn't confront him that night. Instead, I stood in the laundry room and felt a strange, icy clarity wash over me. He wasn't just stealing my work anymore. He was using my father's hard-earned legacy to buy the affection of a girl who wasn't even born when we started this company. He thought I was too traditional, too old-fashioned, to notice the digital breadcrumbs or the missing funds. He mistook my silence for ignorance and my devotion for weakness. He thought he was playing a game with a simple craftsman, but he forgot that a restorer knows exactly how to peel back the layers of a lie until the ugly truth is revealed. As the elevator doors down the hall slid open with a soft, metallic hiss, I looked down at the plastic cup on the counter. The red flags had been flying for months. Tonight, I was finally pulling them down to make room for the wrecking ball. I didn't confront him in the laundry room that night, with the Cartier receipt crumpled in my hand. A woman like Jessica would have screamed. A woman like my mother-in-law would have wept. But a restorer's greatest asset is her eye for detail and her infinite patience. I knew that if I moved too soon, the rot would simply hide in another corner of the house. I needed to see the full extent of the damage before I began the demolition. Over the next month, I became a ghost in my own home, a silent observer of a man who thought he was a master of the universe. While Ethan was out at late-night strategy sessions, which I now knew were soundtracked by the giggles of a 23-year-old, I was performing a forensic audit of our lives. I didn't hack his phone. I didn't need to. I simply followed the trail of breadcrumbs his own arrogance had left behind. I discovered that the business expenses he'd been claiming were actually payments for a luxury apartment lease in West Hollywood and weekend getaways to Napa that I supposedly wasn't adventurous enough to enjoy. I didn't hire a cheap private investigator. Instead, I called Mr. Sterling, the Reed family's estate attorney who had served my father for 40 years. We met in the back room of a quiet gallery in the Arts District, surrounded by the scent of old canvas and oil paint, a place where Ethan would never think to look for me. When I laid out the bank statements and the Cartier receipt, Sterling didn't look surprised. He looked disappointed. "Mary," he said, his voice as dry as parchment, "your father was a man of foresight. He knew that talent often attracts parasites." He pulled out the original trust agreement and our prenuptial contract, documents Ethan hadn't looked at since the day we signed them in a flurry of wedding preparations. We turned to the section Ethan had laughed at years ago, the Morality and Financial Integrity Clause. It was a sophisticated piece of legal architecture. It stated that if any beneficiary of the trust engaged in acts of moral turpitude, infidelity, or the systematic misappropriation of trust assets for non-marital purposes, their access to the funds, and any executive positions within companies funded by the trust, would be terminated immediately. Ethan had been so busy playing the role of the big-shot CEO that he had forgotten who actually owned the stage. Every project Rogers Associates had signed in the last 5 years, including this current $1 million restoration of the historic Huntington estate, was backstopped by my family's capital. He wasn't the owner of the empire. He was a manager on a very short, very expensive leash. As I sat in that gallery, I felt a cold, intellectual satisfaction. I wasn't doing this out of a petty desire for revenge. I was doing it for justice. I was protecting the legacy my father had built with his bare hands from a man who treated it like a personal piggy bank. I gave Sterling the green light to prepare the termination of interest papers. I told him I wanted everything ready for the night of the Huntington signing. I wanted the trap to snap shut exactly when Ethan felt most invincible. I returned home that evening, cooked a 3-course dinner, and listened to Ethan brag about his brilliant negotiation tactics for 2 hours. I smiled, I nodded, and I played the role of the supportive, slightly naive wife to perfection. Inside, however, I was already counting down the seconds until his gilded world turned back into the lead it was made of. But my investigation didn't stop at the bank vault. I knew that in the world of high-end architecture, a mistress isn't just a distraction. She's often a parasite looking for a host. I began to look closely at Jessica, the brilliant young intern Ethan had been touting as the future of the firm's marketing. She walked through our office with an air of unearned importance, her heels clicking a little too loudly, her perfumes, expensive scents I knew Ethan had paid for, clashing with the professional atmosphere I had worked so hard to maintain. She didn't just want my husband, she wanted my life. She wanted the invitations to the galas, the respect of the board, and the title of partner. She was a social climber who had mistaken a shortcut for a career. However, people like Jessica always leave a paper trail of their own desperation. I decided to run my own background check, utilizing my connections within the academic circles of Ivy League restoration programs. Jessica's resume was a masterpiece of fiction. She claimed a master's in architectural history from Yale, yet when I called an old colleague who had chaired that department for a decade, the name Jessica Miller didn't ring a single bell. A few more inquiries revealed the truth. She had dropped out of a community college in the Valley after 2 semesters, and had spent the last 3 years networking her way through the assistance of wealthy men. She had forged her transcripts and her letters of recommendation to get into Rogers Associates. She wasn't an architect. She was a fraud with a high-speed internet connection and a talent for Photoshop. She hadn't just deceived Ethan, though his ego had made him an easy target. She had committed professional fraud against my family's firm. One afternoon, a week before the final confrontation, I found her in the office kitchen, admiring her reflection in the stainless steel refrigerator. She didn't see me standing in the doorway. She was wearing a silk blouse that cost more than her monthly salary and was humming a tune as she adjusted the Cartier watch Ethan had bought her. "It's a beautiful piece, isn't it?" I said softly, stepping into the room. She jumped, her hand instinctively covering the watch. "Oh, Mrs. Rogers, yes, it was a gift from my father." I smiled, the kind of gentle, knowing smile I usually reserved for a particularly clumsy apprentice. "How lovely. Your father must have very expensive taste for a man who, according to your emergency contact forms, is a retired postal worker in Fresno." The color drained from her face, but her eyes remained defiant. That's the thing about those who take shortcuts. They believe their own lies right up until the moment they hit the ground. "I meant my godfather," she stammered, her voice thin. I just nodded, pouring myself a glass of water. "Of course. Integrity is such a rare commodity these days, Jessica. Some people spend a lifetime building it, and others think they can just print it out on a piece of heavy cardstock." I left her standing there, trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. She thought she was the hunter, and I was the aging prey. She didn't realize that I had spent my entire life distinguishing between genuine masterpieces and cheap forgeries. And as I walked back to my office, I felt a surge of cold, quiet power. She wasn't just a threat. She was another piece of evidence. I wasn't just losing a husband. I was cleaning out the rot from my father's legacy, one liar at a time. The air in Catherine's San Marino estate always felt thin, as if the heavy velvet curtains and the ancestral portraits were sucking the oxygen out of the room. My mother-in-law sat across from me, her spine as rigid as the Queen Anne chair she occupied, holding a silver spoon with the kind of delicate precision that suggested she'd never had to lift anything heavier than a socialite's reputation in her life. She had summoned me for emergency tea after sensing the tectonic plates of our marriage shifting. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't ask if I was hurt. She simply looked at me through her gold-rimmed spectacles and sighed. "Mary, dear, I've heard rumors of some friction at the office. And I've seen that young girl, that intern. She's quite a loud little thing, isn't she?" Catherine took a sip of tea, her eyes never leaving mine. "But you must remember your position. The Rogers name has stood for excellence in California for 3 generations. A woman of your standing doesn't create a scene, she manages the climate. Men like Ethan, they are like temperamental weather, occasionally stormy, but they always come home to the shelter of a well-maintained hearth." I looked at her, and for the first time I didn't see a formidable matriarch. I saw a frightened woman clinging to the hull of a sinking ship. She was telling me to swallow my dignity to protect a legacy that was currently being liquidated at a West Hollywood jewelry store. "The Rogers name, Catherine?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, but echoing in the vaulted ceiling. "The Rogers name didn't win the Huntington contract. My hands did. The Rogers name didn't keep the creditors at bay during the 2008 crash. My father's trust did. Ethan hasn't added a single brick to this legacy. He's just been the one sitting on the balcony waving at the parade." Catherine's face hardened, the mask of polite concern slipping to reveal the cold porcelain of her own arrogance. "Don't be ungrateful, Mary. We gave you a place in society. We gave you a family. You were a girl from a cabinet maker's shop in Ohio, and we made you a Rogers. If you choose to tear this down over a temporary lapse in Ethan's judgment, you aren't just destroying him, you're destroying yourself. Think of the tradition. Think of the appearances." It was in that moment that the last tether snapped. I realized that for 20 years, I had been trying to restore a ruin that wasn't worth saving. I had been treating our marriage like a priceless artifact, carefully filling in the cracks and polishing the surface, while the structure itself was termite-ridden and hollow. "Tradition is just a fancy word for peer pressure from dead people, Catherine," I said, setting my teacup down with a sharp clack that made her flinch. "And as for appearances, I've spent my entire career looking past the surface to see what's actually underneath. What's underneath the Rogers name is my sweat, my father's money, and a whole lot of empty promises. I'm not interested in managing the climate anymore. I'm interested in the truth." As I stood to leave, Catherine's voice followed me, brittle and desperate. "You'll be a nobody without us. A middle-aged woman with a toolbox. No one will remember who you are." I paused at the heavy oak doors, looking back at her. She looked so small amidst all that stolen grandeur. "Actually, Catherine, I'm the only one in this family who knows how to build something from scratch. People might forget the name Rogers, but they never forget the person who actually did the work. Your son didn't inherit a legacy. He inherited a shadow. And I'm finally stepping out of it." I walked out into the bright California sun, the weight of their tradition falling off my shoulders like a shroud. I wasn't just Mary Rogers anymore. I was Mary Reed, and I was finally coming home to myself. The following morning, the sun rose over the Pacific with a clarity that felt like an omen. I didn't go to the office. Instead, I returned to the quiet, mahogany-lined sanctuary of Mr. Sterling's chambers. On the desk lay a thick stack of vellum paper, the legal death warrant for Ethan's ambitions. This was the termination of financial guarantee for the Huntington project. For months, Ethan had been bragging to the press about his crown jewel, a multi-million-dollar restoration of one of California's most historic estates. He had already spent a small fortune of the trust's money on marketing, champagne brunches for the board, and, of course, Jessica's consulting fees. He was so certain of the signing ceremony tonight that he hadn't even bothered to check the funding status. He assumed the Reed Trust was a faucet that would never run dry, no matter how much he fouled the water. Sterling handed me a Mont Blanc pen, the same one my father had used to sign the trust into existence. "Are you sure about the timing, Mary?" he asked, his voice gravelly but kind. "Once you sign this, the bank will freeze the project account within the hour. By the time he stands up to give his speech at the gala tonight, he'll be a man without a balance sheet." I looked down at the signature line. This wasn't just about the money. It was about the fundamental principle of stewardship. My father always told me that wealth without work is a trap, and Ethan had walked right into it. "I'm not just sure, Sterling," I said, the ink flowing smooth and black onto the page. "I'm finally doing what should have been done a decade ago. I'm protecting the labor of my ancestors from the whims of a man who thinks a tuxedo makes him a king." With one swift motion, I signed my name, Mary Reed, omitting the Rogers for the first time in 20 years. It felt like shedding a lead weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. As I left the office, my phone chimed with a text from Ethan. It was a photo of him in his Tom Ford suit, posing in front of a mirror with a smirk that looked more like a sneer. "Everything is set for tonight, babe," it read. The Huntington board is in the palm of my hand. This deal is going to make us untouchable. Don't be late. I need my good luck charm on my arm. I didn't reply. I simply deleted the message. He thought I was his accessory, a piece of living decor to prove his stability while he played house with a fraud. He had no idea that the luck he relied on was actually my silence, and that silence had just ended. I spent the afternoon at a local gallery, looking at 19th century landscapes, letting the piece of real art wash over the chaos of my life. I was the architect of this trap, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't restoring the past. I was designing the future. The stage was now set for the gala. The Huntington board would be there, the press would be there, and Jessica would be there, hidden in the shadows of the lobby, waiting for her winner to come down. I went home, took a long, hot bath, and dressed with the precision of a soldier preparing for a final charge. I chose a vintage Chanel suit in a shade of midnight blue, strong, classic, and impenetrable. I didn't need to look like a victim. I needed to look like the owner of the building. Because by the time the clock struck midnight, that's exactly what I would be. The Rogers Empire was a house of cards, and I had just pulled the bottom one. Now, all I had to do was show up and watch it fall. My mother-in-law thinks I should stay silent to protect a legacy built on my own sweat. What do you think? Should a woman sacrifice her dignity for the sake of appearances? Like this video and comment with the word justice if you agree that a traitor deserves to lose everything. The chime of the private elevator was the sound of a trap snapping shut, a sharp digital note that cut through the humid silence of the penthouse. I didn't stand up. I remained seated at the marble island, the weight of my vintage Chanel suit feeling like armor, my fingers wrapped around the warm, delicate handle of my Wedgwood teacup. The doors slid open, and Jessica stepped out, draped in a silk wrap dress that was clearly intended to be easily removed. She was glowing with the smug, frantic energy of a woman who thought she was about to claim her prize. She stopped dead in her tracks, her heels skidding slightly on the polished hardwood, as her eyes landed on me instead of the half-naked husband she expected. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the scent of her cloying perfume and the muffled sound of Ethan still singing in the shower, oblivious to the fact that his two worlds had just collided. "Mary, I didn't think you were home," she stammered, her hand instinctively flying to her throat, clutching the diamond Cartier watch that I had paid for. Her face, usually so carefully painted with the arrogance of youth, was now a pale mask of panic. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea, letting the silence stretch until she began to fidget. "Don't stand there in the foyer, Jessica. You'll catch a draft," I said, my voice as smooth and cold as a sheet of ice. "Come in. You've been making yourself so comfortable in my life lately. It seems a bit late for modesty now, don't you think?" She took a few hesitant steps forward, looking around the room like a cornered animal searching for an exit. Her eyes darted toward the closed bathroom door, hoping for a rescue that wasn't coming. I reached over and picked up the red Solo plastic cup I had prepared. With a calm, steady hand, I filled it with lukewarm tap water. Not the chilled San Pellegrino I was drinking, but the flat, uninspired water from the faucet. I slid it across the granite toward her. It looked absurdly out of place in this room of crystal and stone, a jagged piece of trash in a palace. "Drink," I commanded softly. "You look parched. Ambition is such a thirsty business, isn't it?" She stared at the cup, her lip trembling. "I don't understand. Mary, I can explain." I cut her off with a single sharp look. "There is nothing to explain that a forensic audit hasn't already told me. But I want you to look at that cup, Jessica. Look at it closely." I leaned forward, the light from the chandelier reflecting in my eyes. "That cup is exactly like you. It's cheap, it's mass-produced, and it's designed to be used once and then thrown away. You thought you were stepping into a high-society life, But you were just a temporary convenience for a man who doesn't know the difference between an investment and a liability. I gestured to my own Wedgwood china, the gold leaf shimmering. This took centuries of tradition and hours of craftsmanship to create. You, on the other hand, are a shortcut. And in this house, we don't keep things that are temporary and disposable once they've served their purpose. Jessica's eyes filled with tears, not of regret, but of the stinging humiliation of being seen exactly for what she was. Before she could find her voice to retort, the bathroom door swung open, and the steam poured out into the hallway, followed by Ethan, wrapped in a towel and grinning like a fool. The grin didn't last 3 seconds. Ethan's humming died in his throat, replaced by a strangled sound that was half gasp, half sob. He stood there, dripping wet in his monogrammed towel, looking back and forth between the two of us like a spectator at a tennis match where the ball was made of lead. His $1,000,000 smile had evaporated, leaving behind the pale, twitching face of a man who realized his house of cards was finally meeting a gale-force wind. "Mary, sweetheart," he began, his voice cracking as he tried to summon that practiced, golden boy charm that had worked for 20 years. It failed him now. He glanced at Jessica, who was trembling by the counter, then back at me, his eyes wide with a frantic animal terror. "This isn't... Jessica was just here to drop off the final Huntington blueprints. I thought I told you. She's incredibly diligent. I was only in the shower because the stress of the signing has been... overwhelming." I didn't let him finish. I didn't even raise my voice. I simply picked up the thick manila folder resting on the marble counter and slid it toward him. It hit the granite with a heavy, final thud. "Save the performance for the Huntington board, Ethan." "Oh, wait, you can't," I said, my voice cutting through his lies like a diamond through glass. I watched him stare at the folder, his hands beginning to shake so violently that his towel slipped an inch. "What are you talking about, Mary? The contract is being signed in 2 hours. The press, the investors, everyone is waiting. I've spent 6 months of my life on this deal." I stood up then, my presence filling the room while he seemed to shrink, becoming smaller and more pathetic with every passing second. He looked like a man who had forgotten that the floor he was standing on was one I had polished myself. "No, Ethan. I spent 6 months on this. You spent 6 months choosing silk pocket squares and taking your intern to Napa on my father's dime," I said, stepping toward him until I could smell the expensive soap he'd used to wash away the scent of his betrayal. I opened the folder to the first page, the notice of termination from the Reed Trust. "I signed the papers this morning. I've officially withdrawn all financial backing from Rogers Associates. Since the Huntington project was 100% collateralized by my family's assets, the bank pulled the funding at noon. The project is dead, Ethan. Your company is technically insolvent as of 3 hours ago. You aren't going to a gala. You're going to a bankruptcy hearing." He lunged for the folder, his wet fingers smudging the ink on the very papers that had just ended his career. He looked like a man trying to catch smoke with his bare hands, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated desperation. "You can't do this. We're a team. The morality clause. Mary, that was just legal fluff to please your father. You're overreacting because of a little lapse in judgment. Think of our reputation." I laughed then, a short, sharp sound that had no humor in it. "A little lapse? You didn't just break a vow, Ethan. You broke a contract. You treated my heritage like a personal ATM and my intelligence like an inconvenience. Did you really think the woman who spends her life restoring 500-year-old artifacts wouldn't notice when the man beside her turned into a cheap forgery?" I looked him dead in the eye, and for the first time in 20 years, I saw him clearly. A man who had mistaken my grace for weakness, now standing naked and penniless in a room he could no longer afford to breathe in. Jessica finally found her voice, though it was thin and trembled with a desperate, ugly kind of defiance. "You're just bitter, Mary," she hissed, clutching her designer handbag as if it could shield her from the truth. "You're old and cold, and you can't stand that Ethan chose someone who actually appreciates his ambition. You can take the money, but you can't take what we have." I looked at her, truly looked at her, and felt nothing but a profound sense of pity. She was still playing the lead in a romance novel, while I was conducting a masterclass in consequences. "Chose you, Jessica?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, but filling the room with a sudden, suffocating weight. "Ethan didn't choose you. He chose a mirror that told him he was a king, while I was busy reminding him he was a man. But you should worry less about his heart and more about your LinkedIn profile. I sent a courier to Rogers Associates' HR department 3 hours ago. Your Yale transcripts, your forged letters of recommendation, and a detailed report of your consulting expenses were all included. You aren't just fired, Jessica. In a town this small and a circle this elite, you're radioactive. You wanted to take a shortcut to the top? Well, you just found the fastest way to the bottom." The girl's face went from pale to a sickly shade of gray as the reality of a blacklisted future settled in. She looked at Ethan, waiting for him to defend her, to promise her that he'd take care of her. But Ethan was busy staring at the manila folder, his mind finally catching up to the legal reality of his situation. The community property," he whispered, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across a sidewalk. "California is a community property state, Mary. You can't just cut me out. Half of this penthouse, half of the firm, half of the Reed Trust. That's mine. I've been your husband for 20 years. He looked up at me, a flicker of his old arrogance returning, fueled by the last-ditch hope of a cornered thief. "You can't just rewrite the law because you're angry." I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the glittering lights of the city I had helped shape, one restoration at a time. "That's where you're wrong, Ethan. You see, the Reed Trust wasn't marital property. It was a gift to me, maintained as a separate entity since the day we wed. And that morality clause you laughed at? It wasn't just in our prenup. It was a condition of the trust's investment in Rogers Associates. By using company funds, my family's funds, to lease an apartment for your mistress, you didn't just cheat on me. You committed a breach of fiduciary duty. You've effectively embezzled from the trust." I turned back to him, my expression as unyielding as the stone I spent my life carving. "The bank isn't just pulling the project funding. They're calling in the personal loans I guaranteed for you. By tomorrow morning, the repo men will be looking for that Tom Ford suit and your Patek Philippe. You didn't marry a woman, Ethan. You married a legacy, and you spent 20 years trying to set it on fire. Today, the sprinklers finally went off." Ethan sank onto the velvet sofa, the very one I had chosen for its historical accuracy, and put his head in his hands. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of a siren on the street below, a fitting soundtrack for the wreck of a man sitting in my living room. Jessica didn't wait for a goodbye. She grabbed her coat and practically ran toward the elevator, her heels clicking a frantic, rhythmic retreat. She didn't look back at the man she loved, and he didn't even look up to see her go. They were two parasites who had finally run out of a host. I stood there for a moment, watching the elevator lights count down to the lobby, and felt a strange, quiet sense of peace. The house was finally clean, the rot was gone. Now all that was left was the restoration. I didn't stay to watch the sunrise from the penthouse. There is a specific kind of silence that follows the collapse of a long-term lie. A heavy, sterile quiet that no amount of expensive furniture can mask. I walked into the master bedroom, past the Tom Ford suit still laid out on the bed, and packed a single leather suitcase. I didn't take the jewelry Ethan had bought me with my own money, nor the designer gowns meant for gala nights that always felt like a costume. I took my journals, my father's original drafting tools, and a few pieces of antique lace I had restored when I was still a girl in Ohio. Ethan was still sitting on the velvet sofa, his head in his hands, a broken man in a gilded cage. He didn't look up when I walked to the door. He didn't have the strength to face the woman who had finally stopped being his foundation. As I stood in the foyer, my hand on the heavy oak door, my phone buzzed one last time. It was a message from the Huntington Estate Board of Directors. They had received my personal memo regarding the withdrawal of the Rogers firm. But more importantly, they were asking if Mary Reed, not Rogers Associates, would be willing to consult on the project as an independent lead. They knew who had actually drawn the sketches. They knew whose hands held the expertise. I smiled, a genuine warm feeling that started in my chest and radiated outward. The Rogers name was a brand that had just gone bankrupt, but the Reed talent was still the gold standard of the industry. I wasn't just leaving a marriage, I was reclaiming a career that had been hidden in the shadows for far too long. I took the elevator down, the same one Jessica had fled in minutes before. When I stepped out into the crisp California night, the air felt different, thinner, cleaner, and full of possibility. I looked up at the penthouse windows, glowing like a lighthouse for a ship that had already sailed. I felt no bitterness, only a profound sense of relief. I had spent 20 years trying to restore a man who was inherently flawed, but in the process, I had learned how to perfectly restore myself. I hailed a cab and gave the driver the address to my private studio in the Arts District, a space Ethan never visited because he found it too industrial. To me, it was the only place that had ever felt like home. Success, I've realized, isn't about the name on the building or the car in the driveway. It's about the peace that comes from knowing you've lived your life with integrity and that your hard work is a legacy no one can steal. As the car moved through the streets of Los Angeles, I watched the city lights blur into a tapestry of silver and gold. I was 45 years old, and for the first time in my life, I was completely free. I was a daughter, a restorer, and a survivor. But most importantly, I was finally the master of my own destiny. The artifacts of my past were broken, yes, but as any good restorer knows, it's the gold in the cracks that makes the piece truly priceless. Thank you for walking this journey with me. I've learned that a broken life, much like a broken artifact, can be restored to something even more beautiful. What's your take on this? Do you think Ethan and Jessica got what they deserved? Please like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Stay strong and remember your worth.